Thank you for being here today, Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
I wanted to start off with your goal of shutting down the Education Department. You've previously said that Congress could pass legislation to do that next year. Do you still expect that to be the timeline?
I don't know that I have said that they could do it next year. I don't know what the timeline is going to be, but clearly the Department of Education cannot close without congressional action and consent. So it is my goal to continue to work with them. I meet with senators and congressmen, individually to talk about things, and I look forward to continuing to do that, because I think if they are going to agree to vote to close the Department of Education, they need to have buy-in on what it is we're trying to accomplish, and that is to keep the services and the funding continuing to flow through the states for use for educational services, but that the main decider of how those funds will be used, other than statutorily provided funds, will be up to the states.
Have you talked to Democrats about that goal? Have you gotten buy-in from them to support legislation to do this?
I have gotten buy-in on both sides, more buy-in, I think, on the Republican conservative side than the Democrat side, and I've not had a lot of conversations on either side yet. We're just beginning that process, other than when I've testified, before congressional hearings or during my confirmation hearing. It's been probably the most en masse conversations that I've had.
Can you say what Democrats have said that they would support shutting down the Education Department?
I don't recall any particular senator or congressman or congresswoman that I've had that conversation with, but generally speaking, they are all for being behind raising test scores, having better performance for the students in our country. But I think at this point I could probably honestly say that they're relatively evenly divided.
I want to talk about the headlines that we've seen from the administration. Obviously, several different agencies have revoked billions of dollars in funding to many private universities, including Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, Brown, Princeton. Which schools, if any, are on track to getting their funding back from the government?
The first university that we started this process with was Colombia. I visited with the then acting president, Katrina Armstrong, on campus at Columbia, and we basically were starting our conversation relative to anti-Semitism activities that had gone on before and that were still continuing in some ways, though some of it was a little better. That's how we began our conversation, but then we wanted to look at other aspects of the programs that they had on campus, how they were vetting their students. Did they believe that a lot of the uprisings on campus came from outside agitators or students that were on campus? What were some of the ways that they were managing those activities on campus? And I think we have had really good, open, honest discussions. I've now met with the current president of Columbia twice, and had a telephone conversation with her. I'm sorry, I've met with her once, had 2 telephone conversations with her, and I think we've made great progress. Harvard's been a little more strident. They responded to our negotiation outreach with a lawsuit, and I have amended that lawsuit once. Still hopeful that these things can be resolved, through negotiations, and I think just sitting in and understanding what is really best for students that are on campus, that they can be sure that they're in a safe learning environment when they're there, and not be afraid to go to class. But at the same time, we want to make sure if tax dollars are funding a lot of what is going on in the universities, those universities are abiding by the laws of the United States.
Do the universities think that they will get their funding back at the end of their negotiations with the administration?
Are they saying that they are, or are they asking will they?
Well, would the administration allow them to get that funding back?
Well, that's part of the negotiations, of course, that we have that are ongoing. It would be my goal that if universities, colleges and universities are abiding by the laws of the United States and doing what we're expecting of them, that they could expect to have taxpayer funded programs.
Do you think there's a chance that President Trump leaves the White House in 3 years and some of these schools never see that funding come back?
I would hope that's not the case. We're certainly trying to move much more expeditiously. And what we've seen since we really began this effort, it was kind of a hard hammer at first. And so we've now seen a lot of other universities who are starting to look at their practices and their programs and getting ahead of the curve so that they can report back sort of a self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is probably not a good way to phrase it, because we couldn't allow that at first, but certainly self-evaluation, I think, is a better way to say it.
You've talked about universities potentially supplementing the funding that they've lost with their own endowments or potentially other sources. Do you see a future where the government no longer invest research dollars into some of the universities that have very large endowments?
Well, I think our universities do some remarkable research. And I think if we look at our research as for the public good, which I think that's intended, then taxpayers, I believe, are willing to see some of their tax dollars support that kind of really good research. And so I would certainly hope that would continue at the university level.
Okay, I want to ask you specifically about Harvard, because no school has seen more funding revoked than Harvard University. The president recently said Harvard is starting to behave. What did he mean by that? And is Harvard back at the negotiating table at this point?
Well, I would never like to pretend to say that everything that the president says that I fully can translate for you. But I think clearly what he's indicating is that we are, I think, making progress in some of the discussions we're having, even though they have taken a hard line. They have, for instance, replaced their head of Middle East studies. They have already put in place some of the things that we have talked about in our negotiations with Colombia. For instance, none of us are suggesting that on college campuses there shouldn't be, there shouldn't be discussion. There can be orderly and nonviolent protests. I mean, college ought to be about the exchange of ideas and debate and all of that, but it has to be done peacefully. You can't have a protest, as the I think it was the president of MIT that I met with last week, said, you can't do a protest at 2 o'clock in the morning. You can't be in the halls of the library and prevent other students from getting to the library to study. But if there are places and time appropriate for a peaceful protest, they should be allowed. And I think we're all in agreement with that.
The IRS is reviewing Harvard's tax-exempt status. When do you expect them to make a decision on that?
I don't know. I think it's something that we raised, the president raised, to take a look at these large universities with, these are really outstandingly large endowments, $53 billion, for Harvard. And that money doesn't just sit still. It is invested. And if it's invested well, they can expect a good return on that investment. And so as the citizens of our country are providing tax support for those universities that do take federal tax dollars, then maybe some of that should come back, to our citizens.
Is the administration planning more actions related to Harvard University?
At this particular time, we're continuing with the things that we've already talked about. One action we did take relative to Colombia was to make their creditor aware that they needed to make sure that Colombia was abiding by the law of the land, because they had an infraction, with the Title VI civil rights, which was our position, and that they should examine that, because part of the accreditor's position is to make sure that colleges are lawful, or they can risk losing their accreditation.
Did something change in your conversations with Colombia that made you send that letter? Because you have been talking so positively about your conversations with the president and with the university generally.
I think one of the things that made us take another look at it is just we're looking at accreditation in general, for colleges and universities, because there has been some complaint about that we need to expand the number. That when you think about the fact that all law schools are accredited, by the ABA, that's it's like a real monopoly, in some areas. There have been some times now that you could change accreditors. Used to be bound geographically, but some changes in the rules. So as we've looked at accreditors, we wanted to make sure, okay, let's make sure that we are touching all the bases that are relative to how our universities need to comport themselves.
So you think other universities' accreditation status should also be in question as well?
I think accreditors have a responsibility. It's built into what they're supposed to be doing. So we've reminded the Colombia accreditors, and I think all accreditors now will make sure that they are abiding by the terms of their agreements.
In that letter to Colombia, you talked about federal student aid. Is that something that you would consider limiting for universities broadly if you can't come to an agreement with them?
Ask me a different way.
I suppose, do you think that the administration, your department specifically, should restrict access to federal student aid for universities if you feel like they're violating civil rights?
Well, I think certainly the American citizens and taxpayers would expect that if colleges and universities, I would believe, and I've certainly heard, if their taxpayer dollars are going to those universities and that there is student aid coming for those, that we would expect that they would abide by, number one, abide by the law. Mm-hmm. And I think if a university is accepting federal aid, mm-hmm. We've obviously looked at that federal aid.
There's been reports that consent decrees were on the table with Columbia University. Is that accurate? Is that a tool that you would use?
We've discussed consent decree, and so our negotiations have gone, back and forth. That's, it's been part of the negotiations.
What we've seen over the past couple of weeks has really looked like an all-of-government approach when it comes to higher education, whether it's the State Department or HHS. Can you walk us through how those decisions are made? Are you guys coordinating with each other? Are you speaking directly with the president before you take decisions? Well,
the president clearly has a stated goal and gives direction, and we take that direction, obviously. But there are parts of it that hasn't all come necessarily at the same time. When there was a focus on international students and should we stop international students from coming here or taking a look at their visas and et cetera, the State Department took on that branch of it. And the courts have reacted. I think it was yesterday. The court said, no, that process needs to be reversed. We need to be allowing these students to come back in. But we then say, okay, well, let's just make sure that we're conveying to these universities and colleges that as these students do come in, they need to know more about their background. Because when I've asked some of the presidents that I've talked to, do you think that a lot of agitation that's occurred on campus, are they occurring with students who are going here? Are there outside agitators who are coming in? Do you see it happening more with foreign students than domestic students? And so it's really important, I think, to have a handle on that student population. And I think that's fair. And also universities, a little bit aside from students specifically, universities are required under Section 117 of the Higher Education Act to report on the amount of foreign funding they are receiving and where it's coming from, because they want to make sure there's no undue influence, being levered, against the United States.
So is it best to say that agencies are making these decisions independently, or are agencies coordinating with each other?
We have coordinated. In fact, we've had a task force. The first actions that were taken, with Columbia was with the task force, which was GSA, HHS, and the Department of Education. We've also now, brought in DOJ as part of the process as well. So yes, there is a coordination with the agencies.
Okay, you mentioned international students. The president has floated imposing a 15% cap on international students, specifically talking about Harvard University, but I suppose he could mean all universities. How would something like that work?
I'm not quite sure, but clearly, Harvard's foreign population right now is at about 27%, and we just want to make sure that I think the president just wants to make sure that we're looking at making sure that students in the United States aren't penalized by allowing too many international students, to come in. And so what is that right balance? And I'm not sure what it is, but the president certainly floated 15%. So let's see, as we discuss that and investigate it, how that plays out.
You're a former CEO. You came from the business world. Do you worry that less international students could make American companies less competitive?
I think there is such merit in having international students be part of our university population. As I mentioned earlier, or I might not have mentioned in this interview, but as we were talking earlier, I served on the board of university in Connecticut, Sacred Heart University, for 16 years. So I know that having international students on campus does help with that cultural exchange. And we actually had a campus in Ireland from Sacred Heart. So I really understand that exchange and how culturally it's very beneficial. So I want to make sure that we don't lose that. I think that's important for us to have. But on the same time, if you think about just last week when it was discovered in the backpack of a research student at the University of Michigan, these fungus spores that were intended to be utilized against our agricultural products, those are the kinds of things that we have to make sure that we are on guard against. And whether that would be students with this country, but most of the time I think that would have the propensity at least to come in internationally. That could destroy your crops in America. I heard from the department, from the Secretary of Agriculture, when she was saying, you know, that these things are so dangerous because America feeds not only ourselves, but we feed the world. And if we are looking to destroy or weaken our crop production here, it's not only, you know, for our food, for our health, but it's also our national defense. So those kinds of measures, I think we have to be very, very specific and sure about.
You previously led the Small Business Administration. The president has asked that agency to take over your department's oversight of student loans. What's the status of that transition? Is that still happening?
It was one of the suggestions as we first started to talk about dismantling the department, what functions would go, perhaps to which agencies. He had asked about SBA, also asked about Treasury. We've talked about HHS, perhaps looking at the IDEA program, but all of that is still part of discussion. It's not an assignment in any way, except that Treasury has taken back over the collection of student loans as it always has done, served in that capacity. So that's not new relative to Treasury.
The reconciliation bill has a lot of changes to federal student aid, and one provision in particular asks you to basically place a cap on the amount of loans that people can borrow based on the program that they're choosing. Have you started to calculate what it would cost to have a psychology degree or an engineering degree?
I've not actually started that process yet, except in conversations. I know that Congress had started a lot of that kind of work and had done some research relative to what the mean cost was across the country to take, you know, different courses, and should lending kind of be based on that median or that mean cost. And I think that is one of the things that I think it was Representative Fox who has worked so diligently to bring down the cost of college, one of the things that she talked about. And so that is something to look at, especially for students who can graduate so overburdened by debt and not really understanding that the profession that they have chosen could never give them the amount of income, or at least the projected or the proven stated amounts of income that they might receive to pay off that loan. And part of what we are doing with the restructuring of the FAFSA application for college is trying to work in some language eventually that will say, this is what you could expect to earn relative to this kind of degree and program. This is what this college charges for it. This is what a different college would charge for it. Put this into your calculus as to where you would like to go to school and have the biggest ROI on what you're doing. I think those are really sensible measures to be taking, and how to look at it, because so many students have no ideas. I'll tell you just a little side story. When I was running for the Senate in Connecticut back in 2010, and I went to a freshman class in college, and I said, of all of you who are in this class, how many of you have student aid? You know, 95% of hands go up. I said, how many of you know how much interest you're paying on that loan? Maybe half the hands went up. I said, how many of you know the actual amount of the loan? Fewer. I said, how many of you know what kind of a job you would have to have and how much money you'd have to make to start repaying this loan? Not a single hand went up. So I think we need to provide students with better tools of assessing the value of what education they need, and do they need a four-year college? Or are they better suited for some other kind? Is it community college? Are we looking at our skill-based education? How does technology and AI play into all of that in their learning process? I think we kind of need to rethink in our whole culture of how we look at education.
Okay, my last question before we turn to the audience. Would you make those calculations public? Because it could affect what major students decide to pursue.
Oh, definitely. They'll be part of the public forum. And I think that's a great thing to share with anyone who's contemplating going to class and going to college or university or community college or however they decide to look at their career. That's, I think, vital information for them to have. And for parents.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take some questions from the audience. If you could just raise your hand. We just ask that people say your name and organization before you ask your question.
Thank you, Secretary McMahon and Akayla, for the conversation. Arthur Jones II, ABC News. You have reduced nearly half of the agency's workforce over the last couple of months, and several more are on paid administrative leave still. Are you going to make another RIF at the department, and have you helped any of those employees find new jobs?
We don't anticipate another RIF. It's a deep cut that we started with. And look, I've been in the private sector, and in the private sector we would call that restructuring, and it's painful. It is painful for people to be let go from their jobs, and so I know how important it is to provide a good off-ramp for them, to provide resume, helping them with their resumes, providing them with job connections and other HRs, or if there's jobs in government that might be available for them. We've done all of that. We've had classes for them, et cetera, because I do believe that we want to be as helpful as we possibly can to relocate those folks and for them to have good jobs.
Hello. Katie Balls from the Times of London. Fascinating discussion. A lot of British students dream of studying at Harvard, quite rightly. And I wondered, what's your message to these international students? Is the US still open to them? Is this something they should still aspire to, taking into account some of the visa issues?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest to the students of any country where they should go, but I know that Harvard University is certainly one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and we'd like to continue to encourage students to come here and study. Some of the students also go to Oxford here from the United States and other universities, so I think that cross-cultural is very important. I think the University of Hartford provides an outstanding education, and would like to see us continue to invite those students in under a lot of the premises that we've talked about today.
Secretary McMahon, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Olivia Japong, and I'm a legislative analyst with Bloomberg Government, so related to BN, but different branch of the organization. I was wondering, the administration has proposed the consolidation of 18 grants into that K12 simplified funding grant, the $2 billion grant. What's your message to states or local education agencies that don't necessarily fund all of those 18 programs that are being consolidated into that one grant? And what plans have you heard of from state and local leaders as far as what they're wanting to fund and what might not get funding anymore?
Thank you for that question very much. I've not heard specifically from individual states, because this is very new that they're hearing this, really as I think as I talked about in my testimony before the Appropriations Committees both the last couple of weeks. And what that's doing is yes, we're consolidating, providing a lot less regulation. Applying for grants is an incredibly tedious, expensive project to go through, sometimes taking 1.5 to 2 years to get those grants approved. One of the ways of putting this simplified funding program into a single stream going to the states is that those states then take that money, and it's without the regulatory strings attached to it, even though there's some oversight, but without the regulatory strings attached. They don't have to apply for the grants. The states themselves then determine how that money is spent and where it's spent. It's on a formulaic basis of taking that $2 billion, and that formula has not yet been determined. It's still in negotiations. But while there is also a net reduction in total amount of funding, the other side of that is we have gotten rid of so much of the regulatory burden. It's such an interesting stat that I learned early on, and that is for every dollar that goes into a school room, if you will. Teachers spend 47 cents of that dollar in regulatory compliance. So the goal is, while there's an overall reduction in the total funding, that we have also eliminated a lot of the regulatory burden and red tape, that there would be a compliance reduction and would offset a good portion of that. Welcome.
Madam Secretary, thank you for doing this, and Akayla, thank you for the thoughtful discussion. I'm Betsy Klein with CNN. The sources that I've talked to at the White House in the California state legislature are indicating that termination of grant funding for the UC and CSU systems is something that is under consideration, could be happening imminently. I wonder, how is the administration thinking about who to target next and how that might play out differently, given that this is a public university system?
Well, in California, I think we saw pretty flagrant violations of Title IX, and that is why this focus, was put on them. I think we saw that, was just a week ago, unless I'm confused about what you're talking about. I think that is exactly what you're referring to, that we have men participating in women's sports, which is clearly against Title IX, and the president has made it very clear that he is definitely going to uphold Title IX. So in terms of, we're not putting a bullseye out there and trying to find targets for things. When we're seeing violations, we want to make sure that we are addressing them. Because if we don't address them as they occur, then it's sort of by acquiescence that it's okay to continue, and it's not.
Hi, I'm David Smith of The Guardian. We've seen universities in Britain, Canada, other places say America is no longer welcoming for students. There's a lot of negative headlines. This is a historic opportunity for those other countries to attract students. Does that concern you at all, that America's brand is being damaged by the controversies around visas?
Well, I do think that when you, I could only imagine that if you were part of the international community and there was issues being raised relative to the visas of foreign students who were coming here, shutting them off or whatever, that there would be some negative headlines about that. There are still so many applicants who want to come to the United States to study that I don't have a worry that they're going to stop coming to the United States. I think the measures that we're putting in place are good for all students that are coming, because I believe all students coming to our campuses want to believe that they are coming to a safe learning environment. They're going to have access to the education that they're paying for, and that they want to have a fulfilling experience while they're here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Laura Meckler from the Washington Post. Your department has done some, pretty thorough civil rights investigations of certain violations along the lines of gender or race, and we've seen those play out through the Office for Civil Rights process. At the same time, the Anti-Semitism Task Force has sort of gone around that process and gone sort of directly to demands to the university. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thinking about when these investigations should follow the prescribed process, which I believe is prescribed in statute, and when it makes sense to do it in a different way, and what the justification is for doing sort of a direct, essentially going directly to making demands of the university without first having had like a formal investigation.
Well, I can tell you, if you watched on television, and I would suspect some of the affiliates, from here, we're clearly covering what was going on at Columbia and Harvard, other instances where students really were attacked, professors were attacked. There was an action that needed to be taken. And so we did not allow that to stand and went into to take the action to stop that, because students and faculty need to feel safe where they are. Parents need to feel that their students are safe where they're sending them to school. I think that was a blatantly obvious infraction that was going on.
Well, just to follow up, that was obviously that involves the protests and some of the issues around Title Title VI and anti-Semitism, but some of the demands to Columbia and to Harvard also were things in the area of DEI, and those things are a little more complicated maybe about whether they were in violation or not. And was there any investigation in those, and what's your thinking about making demands, for instance, have ideological diversity? One of the things you asked of Harvard was that they have ideological diversity. Is that the role of the federal government to ask them to do that, and what is the role of having an investigation first versus demands first?
Let me see if we can unpack the full breadth
Sorry.
of that question.
Sorry about that.
Or that statement. I do know that our Office of Civil Rights clearly is investigating, like in California. We did our investigation. We found that they were in violation of Title IX, and so that is the process that we do follow. I think the role of the government, as I said before, is to assure that students who are on campus are in a safe environment. We talked about diversity in terms of opinion and ideology at Harvard, because by Harvard's own statistics, they only had 3% of conservative professors on campus. That was reported in the Harvard Crimson. And our review was, well, how is that real diversity of ideology and opinion with that few relative to the total structure of education that is going on at Harvard? And so that is something that we raised, because there are issues when in the whole diversity program, when you are really teaching in terms of the oppressed and the oppressor, that is just not in compliance with what I think we should be teaching, in our country. I think there should be more of that diversity. And so we would investigate if we thought that any of that were leading to any of the unrest that we saw at some of the universities.
Secretary McMahon, Mike Bender with the New York Times. Just to follow up on that, can you sort of sum up for us what you think the sort of whole of government approach against Harvard has accomplished so far, and what concerns or risks you think might present the task force or the department or the administration the longer these investigations and negotiations and court cases go on for?
Well, certainly Harvard has sued the Department of Education, and so we'll see what the courts decide on that. However, some of the parts of their suit, I think, are not relative to the action that we actually took, but that remains for the courts to decide. So I think there's always the opportunity for lawyers to be involved when you have made some demands and when you've shut down programs. So I would expect some of that to continue. The whole of government approach, I think, has actually been to let universities and colleges, to let them understand that if you are receiving federal dollars, there are compliance issues that you're going to make sure that are in place, or you are at risk of losing some of that federal funding.
Any accomplishments so far in that goal?
Well, as I mentioned, relative to Harvard, they, not necessarily them saying, well, because of this X happened, but we have noticed that they did replace their head of Middle Eastern studies, because they felt that they needed to make some adjustments there. So we were pleased to see that.
Hi, Sarah Halzak, Bloomberg News. I'm wondering if we could revisit the topic of accreditation a bit. You talked about looking at that more broadly. If the commission does not end up revoking Columbia's accreditation, is ceasing to recognize an accreditor something that you're considering? Is that on the table?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear exactly everything. Could you repeat that?
Sure. On accreditation,
you have a very soft voice.
I'm sorry. On the question of accreditation, if the commission does not revoke Columbia's accreditation status, would you consider ceasing to recognize the commission?
Well, no. This is part of what we asked them to look into, and we want to hold accreditors accountable, as well as accreditors need to hold the universities accountable for for their mission. That's the direction. That's the job of an accreditor. So if It's just that you don't go in and revoke. You know, an accreditor goes in and said, we have this finding, or this has been brought to our attention. What do you have to say? It's about a negotiation. It's an opportunity to correct. It's not just to yank.
Hi, Secretary. This is Stephanie Lai with Bloomberg News. We're seeing some reporting out of Politico that the Trump administration is considering withholding federal funding for California, specifically that the Education Department would not disperse formula funds. I'm wondering if that's something that you can speak to or confirm if it's happening.
Well, I think that is part of what we found with the state of California just blatantly refusing to be in compliance with the Title IX regulations. And so that is, you know, one of the tools and the opportunities that we have with California. I think it's right that we make them aware that that is a risk that they run.
Okay, I think that's all the time that we have questions for. Thank you so much, Secretary, for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was great. Thank you.